Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Morning Shots, and it's my privilege today to have Ernest Roots, the very famous now Ernest Roots, who's been, well, everywhere. How you doing, Ernest?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Byron. It's good to speak with you and good to be back on Morning Shot.
Well, I don't feel as famous as Joe Rogan and the rest of the people that you've been rubbing shoulders with. What's it
It-
been like being a podcast celebrity in the US?
well, it's been quite a ride. I haven't spoken with Joe Rogan. Hopefully, that will still work out. But yes, I've had sort of somewhat of a podcast circuit recently, speaking with Tucker Carlson, with Jordan Peterson, with Ben Shapiro, and some others as well. And it's really something, and it's I think we have a lot to be grateful for in the sense that there is sort of this rediscovery of what is happening in South Africa. Not that it could really be ignored much longer, but I mean, this narrative about South Africa being this incredible, peaceful miracle, led by the freedom loving ANC, has been in place for quite some time, and it has just broken down. And a lot of people, I think, cannot ignore this anymore, which is why I think part of the reason why a lot of these podcasters and public influencers, you could say, have taken such an interest in South Africa, because there's a lot to say about South Africa, and there's a lot to learn about South Africa, and I think we should build on these opportunities that open up as a result of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that we say on Morning Show quite a lot. The South Africanization of the Western world seems to be, it's a real thing. Like many countries are grappling with the issues that we've kind of gone through. I think it's very famous, very famous line that's come out of White House is that South Africa appears to be the DER critical race theory principles being put in practice, but on the scale of a country rather than a corporate. So they have a very good understanding as to where all these initiatives are going. Now, as you know, Trump has had a laser focus on South Africa, and that's obviously meant that because of some of the things like the executive order that he put, that's obviously shone quite a big light on South Africa. He
Mhm.
said famously, bad things are happening in South Africa. So now obviously everybody's asking the question, what are these bad things? We thought South Africa was a nice peaceful dispensation where everybody lives in kumbaya. Have you found that going around and talking to people, have you found they're shocked at the things you have to say, or people kind of like, oh, it's kind of what we knew?
Yeah, no, well, you do get both. So someone like Tucker Carlson, when I spoke with him, he's a very well-read person, and he's very well up to speed with what's happening all over the world. And it's actually quite, I don't want to say surprising, but insightful to speak with him about what's happening in the world and to see the extent to which he can comment, with detailed analysis and commentary and so forth. And so he, for example, he's known about this, and he was one of the first big platforms, you could say, to start talking about what's happening in South Africa. And I think in some ways he opened the door. Um, and but he's had this frustration that he's been aware of what's happening in South Africa, but a lot of other people don't want to believe it. But then you really get to people who, and I should say slightly less in America, more in Europe, people who really want to believe this Rainbow Nation miracle story. And in as far as they don't believe that it's failing, or they don't want to believe it, they would either argue with you, they would either try to defend what the ANC is doing, they would try to make this argument that no, typically what we hear in South Africa as well, that actually what we need is more aggressive land reform and more aggressive BEE, and that's sort of going to pull through and then it'll work. But the worst type of reaction that I've encountered is people, even though they wouldn't say this explicitly, it would definitely be the undertone to their commentary, and that would be that yes, it's bad, and we concede that it's bad, but in as far as it's bad, it's because you deserve it. So, like the farm killings, for
Mm,
example, is, oh yeah, well, I know, I've read about that, but the farmers are really bad
but you
people.
deserve it.
Yeah, you deserve it.
Mm.
And I think that's the worst of it all. But I think all of these narratives are becoming more difficult just as reality is catching up with people.
Yeah, I mean, we're finding this quite a lot actually in the Israel debate. You know, it's like, yeah, I said this the other day on one of my videos. You're finding a lot of people going, oh, you know, the Nazis, they did a great thing when they committed genocide, but actually they didn't really commit genocide, right? There was no Holocaust, but it was a good thing that they did commit a Holocaust. It's like
Yes.
these two claims aren't the same, right?
Yeah.
You either believe there was none or you believe it was a good thing. Like
Yeah.
pick a side. But
Yeah.
they know that by saying it was a good thing, they're not exactly the good guys in the story, are they? So
Yeah.
I think you're experiencing the same thing. It's like you deserve it, but it's not actually happening, right?
Yeah, it's that's exactly right. It's really strange how people can hold these George Orwell would say double speak or these contradictory ideas in their heads at the same time. Like the example you mentioned is just saying no, it didn't happen, but in as far as it is happening, it's a good thing that it is happening. And it's the same type of logic that is applied with people who run to the defense of Cyril Ramaphosa, of the ANC, of the South African government. They would, and there's actually a term for this. It's called celebration parallax. It was coined by Michael Anton who was with Hillsdale, but he also worked for the previous Trump administration, and now again for the current Trump administration. And so a parallax is, of course, looking at the same thing from different perspectives, and then you have somewhat of a different view. And the celebration parallax is a way of saying that two people can say the exact same thing, but depending on the person saying that will depend on whether that statement is rejected or celebrated. And the famous example in the American context is when Joe Biden announced Kamala Harris as his running mate in the previous election, and he said that he is going to choose someone who is a black woman. It has to be a woman and it has to be a person of color. And he was then celebrated for this, for being inclusive. And then, but when someone like Trump comes out and says Kamala Harris was chosen because she's a woman and because she's a person of color,
Okay, no, because she was brilliant.
yeah, then somehow that doesn't apply anymore. And it's the same
No.
logic that is applied to South Africa, like in terms of how these BEE laws are being defended. When Ramaphosa says we need to when he says, for example, we need to take the land and give it back to our people, then people would celebrate him saying that. When someone like you or I come out and say the president is using the term our people to refer to a very particular section of society, then the same people who would celebrate him saying that would attack you and me for pointing it out. And it's really bizarre, but
Disagreed.
it's just a bizarre case of doublespeak. It's really Orwellian where we are in all of this.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the reason the Trump administration is not so keen to actually engage with the South African government now, because they seem to understand full well the way the lexicon moves now. It's like, you know, we're not applying race-based legislation. We're doing transformation.
Yeah.
We're not stealing the land. We're not expropriating it. We're redistributing it. You know, it's like just because you reclassify the terms to terms that you think are slightly more palatable to individuals doesn't mean you're not doing what you're saying you're doing. It's still the same thing. You're just reclassifying the terms to be slightly more palatable. You know, you're not excluding parties from the economy. What you're actually doing is you're readdressing historical injustices. I mean, that sounds so much nicer, but it doesn't mean that you're not excluding people, right?
Yeah, so there's this story now for the last 2 or 3 days about this minister in the ANC who's trying to push through this what they would call employment equity bill, and she comes across as being very, very openly and publicly disappointed by the fact that there are still people who do not support transformation. And then she would present transformation as this very noble pursuit of empowering people who aren't empowered and making sure that people who do not have access get access. But that's not what it is. It's counting heads and it's looking at skin color and it's categorizing people according to the color of their skin. And it's really strange that in the year 2025, we still have people arguing in favor of such policies when it's so clear that it doesn't work. It's so clear that it's only a racist policy, and it's not even uplifting anyone. It's not empowering anyone. It's not uplifting anyone. It's really only something that entrenches the political elites. But they would frame it in this very flowery language about transforming the country with the sort of the undertone that we're actually transforming from good to great and stuff like that. But it's just a racist agenda that they have these flowery terms to sort of sprinkle over it.
So I'm going to quote Helen Zilli because I think actually she's spot on this specific observation. So actually during the court cases, her counsel made a very startling observation, and that is, it's all good and fine to have equality in the workplace and to transform the workplace, but the key criteria is that you actually have a workplace. Otherwise, if you don't have a workplace, you can have all the equality and transformation that you want, but it's not going to mean anything. You're all going to be equal in the unemployment line.
Yeah.
So, actually applying a policy that destroys the workplace is counterintuitive, regardless of what the end goals are meant to be. And it's a very good observation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the problem here is that especially those in power in South Africa know nothing other than struggle. They are defined, and they define themselves, and they want to be defined by the idea of struggle, by the idea of waging war against something, and by the idea that they would succeed in their ideological quest if they can succeed in destroying something. And so this something that needs to be destroyed is the prime enemy and the prime target. But there's zero emphasis on upliftment. There's zero emphasis on education. So if you ask them, is education important? Of course, they would say, yes, education is important. But if you look at their priorities, if you look at what they do, fixing the education system is not even on the list. And the only frame of reference that they would allow themselves to have is one of destruction. And so if you want to talk about the unemployment crisis, something needs to be destroyed. We need to find something and destroy it, and that somehow would lead to some form of a solution. And now what they're effectively doing is actively working to destroy the workplace, as if some phoenix would rise from the ashes. And they can't even give examples of where this has worked in the past. And I don't even think they really
Do you
want to
remember
give
that?
examples, because they're just stuck in this
Do you,
ideological bubble.
do you remember that famous line from the One Minister? And the One Minister says, "Let the brand fall. Don't worry, we'll pick it up."
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
mentality. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's really bizarre. And they make these very flashy comments about the economy and so forth when they have no clue about the very basics of economics. It's really something to witness, but somehow it seems to work for them, at least so far, at least in terms of getting them in power and them holding on to that power.
I think it's difficult because when you look at some of the individuals that are there, and I spoke with last week with Antia Jeffries about this, and it was a very curious conversation because one of the observations that I tended to get out of this is that a lot of the people currently pushing these policies were all trained by the Soviet Union, around the 1950s, 1960s, when they were all doing the armed struggle. But the reality is these guys are dying. Like, they're dying at a fast rate. There's actually very few of them left. And the question really is, what happens now with the next lot that come in? What do they think? Because they've not been exposed to the same, should we call it, ideological training. And she said, yeah, that's one of the reasons that the Chinese are so heavily invested in training some of the ANC members to try like re-idealize them, to give them that ideology that they basically didn't get from the struggle.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like the SNP, right? So that the entire basis of the SNP is to have Scottish independence. And that's what happens when you actually have independence. UKIP had this problem. They wanted the UK to leave Europe. Well, then they got the UK leaving Europe. Well, now what?
Yeah.
Do you just close the party? Like, now what?
Yeah.
You have the same problem with the ANC, right? I mean, one of the original cores of the ANC was to end apartheid. Well, apartheid's ended.
Mm-hmm.
So now
And
what?
now they would
You
like us
define.
to believe that no, actually apartheid has not ended, because they don't know what to do after ending apartheid. So So the only way for them to move forward is to actually say, to undermine their own success by saying that they were not successful. They need to go back because the struggle is not over.
And that's exactly what's happening, right? So in the workplace, there's still apartheid in the workplace. And it's like, even if our apartheid's ended, well, then we have to go fight somebody else's apartheid. There's an apartheid in Palestine, we think. So let's go fight that one. I mean, we fight against apartheid. So let's do that.
But there's something in this that I think you made an important point, is about how the, let's call it, the struggle elites in South Africa, because it's not only the ANC, it's sort of the organization surrounding the ANC as well, the SACP, the COSATU people, and so forth. All of them have become incredibly shallow ideologically. And when I say shallow, I don't mean that they say things that I disagree with. You can have some form of ideological depth and be wrong. Like Karl Marx had ideological depth, even though he was wrong. But I mean, he at least had a proper framework, and he was able to explain it, and he was able to argue it, and so forth. But these guys have lost that, and they, you're right, they were actually very good in the 80s, in the 70s, and the 80s was probably the pinnacle of the ANC in terms of, or the liberation movement, if we want to use that term, in terms of their ideological development. And then it just stopped. It stopped with the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall fell, their own ideological or intellectual growth just disappeared with that. And so it's really bizarre today to still hear these people make the exact same arguments they made in 1985. There's been no growth, there was no development, there was no intellectual endeavors to sort of adapt to changing circumstances. Everything happening in 2025 in South Africa or in the world is still explained as if we live in the Cold War, and as if we're still in 1985 or 1984, we could say. And what's also happening is that these leaders, these intellectual leaders, I mean, Joe Slovo has died some time ago. Many of these people who were intellectual leaders at the time have already died, or they are very old, they're retired. And the new guys are not catching up. They just sort of float around in this space, or this void, you could say. And so, but what I think what is good is the other side of the debate or the discussion has grown tremendously. In the 1990s, the let's call it the counter, use the ANC term, the counter-revolutionary movement.
Counter-revolution.
Yes, was at its low point. There was just nothing you could say in a discussion against the ANC and against what the ANC was trying to achieve. They just had the moral high ground. They had all the arguments. But now the counter-revolutionary argument has developed, and it is still growing, and it is strengthening. And there are nuances and obviously disagreements and so forth. But when we talk about the crisis in South Africa and why the ANC solution, not just the party solution, but that ideological frame of reference isn't working, we can back that up with actual current examples and what's happening at the moment, and references and research and so forth. And then the response from that side is just, oh no, well, apartheid. It's just trying to present the argument as something that is debated in 1985 or something.
Yeah, but the thing, I think, I'm sure you saw the Clairefontaine issue. It's called the EFF going there. I actually did a full documentary on this actually on the channel. It was actually probably the longest thing I've produced as a piece of content, like independent piece of content.
Oh, great!
And I cut up all the speeches and them going there and trashing the place, and I went through the whole thing. It was done all right in terms of views, but I think it was really interesting. There was one of the speeches, this lady, I'm sure you've seen it. She stands up and says, "This country was destroyed in 1913 when Jan van Riebeeck arrived."
I saw
like, you're a couple hundred years late.
Yeah,
like, it's.
I made a post about that on X, and I added another video, which was a member of parliament for the ANC, who said this country was destroyed 2,000 years ago when Jan van Riebeeck arrived. So it was either 1913 or it was the year zero. but somewhere they
Wait, the
know there
year
was
Jesus
young.
was born.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guess when South Africa died.
yeah, exactly. And so that was the one of the someone from the DA, I think, stood up and said, "It seems to me like you're confusing Jan van Riebeeck with Jesus Christ." it's it's but I think there's an important point here to be made, which is that they are completely defined by history, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. People are defined by history, but they want to be defined by history, but they don't know what that history is that they say defines them. And I don't even think they want to know what that history is.
No,
I
this
don't
sounds
know.
like a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I can't think of a single person in sort of the ANC broad circles who's really interested in having an honest, factual conversation about the history of South Africa. I mean, there's a lot of things in South Africa's history that they can build on, that they can use and say, look at this atrocity that happened here, and we need to do this. But the problem is they are presenting history in a way that is so one-dimensional that it has become distorted. And now they don't want to have a conversation about history anymore. They want to bash us with history, but they don't want to talk about what that history actually is. And that's when you get to stuff like one person saying Van Riebeeck took the land in 1913 and the other one
1913.
saying he took the land 2000 years ago, and they don't even know that they're wrong because they just want to say something about history being evil, but they don't know that history themselves.
But I've actually made that argument on Morning Shot, right? So there's this idea that it doesn't really matter what you and I say because we're both like, you know, we're both white. So what the hell do we know? We're just colonizers regardless. But you see, they're from Africa. I mean, it's the equivalent of living on the landmass of, say, you living in France and saying because you share the same landmass as China, that you have equal claim to China, even though you're French living in France, because it's all like one piece of landmass. And like a lot of them are saying, well, you know, we're all African. And so if I'm from West Africa up north, somewhere near freaking Nigeria, don't worry, I've got equal claim to South Africa because it's all like African, right? So, you know, it's all one continent. So, I mean, why do you get to say that your colonization is okay? But they didn't actually colonize because it's all Africa. So it's like if the French colonized Mongolia,
Yeah,
well, it's all the same place anyway. I mean, it's basically France,
yeah,
isn't it?
because they, yeah.
It's like the argument's dumb. It's really dumb.
Yeah, exactly. It's really strange, but and it doesn't speak to local dynamics. And of course, what another part of the history, of course, is the history of the Khoi and the San, who were famously pushed out. And if there really were indigenous people or are indigenous people to South Africa, it would be the Khoi and the San. But that's sort of an inconvenient truth, and so they just try to ignore that. But yes, it is. It's but I think another part or another response to this is like trying to apply this type of thinking to Europe, as you mentioned now. Just imagine how racist it would be to say something like Europe is white people's continent, and black people in Europe should not have rights. They should go back to Africa, even if they've
That's
lived
back their
there for,
land.
like, pointing to some black person who lives in the Netherlands who has lived there for whose family has been there for 300 years, and now saying that doesn't matter because you are still black and therefore you're not welcome and therefore you have no rights, or we should take your land and we should chant about killing you and all of these things. And so it's only a one-way argument. And this is something that's important. There's this sliding scale in the type of rhetoric where they would make they would it's, well, in a certain sense you could say it started with Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream, and what's there to disagree with the statement that someone should be judged by the content of their character as opposed to the color of their skin. But now these activists reject Martin Luther King. So it was a
Yeah.
convenient thing to hold up as an argument back then. It was convenient to use the Mandela arguments in 1992, and now they
But now
reject
he's a
him again.
sellout.
Now he's a sellout and he should be rejected. And so it's just there's no consistency. It's always sort of a incremental changing the line of thinking, and there's no consistency, there's no sense of history, and there's no, as I said, there's no ideological depth to it at all, because it's fundamentally internally contradictory.
As I said to Anthony Jeffries, they hate apartheid, but I don't think they did hate apartheid. I think they just hated the management. You know, they were fine with the infrastructure, but they didn't want to be the underlings. They wanted to be the controllers. Now
Yeah.
they're the controllers. They're like, no, now it's fine. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
So exactly, and so the apartheid is a good example, because we can't have a conversation about that in South Africa, and there's an important conversation to be had, because there's a lot of things that went wrong. There's a lot of good reasons why we shouldn't return to that, but you can't even have that conversation, because the only thing you are allowed to say about apartheid is white people are evil and everything they did was horrible. And if any black person in South Africa suffers or experiences any hardship, that could only be because they were exploited by white people. There's no room for anything else to be part of the conversation. And it doesn't, it sort of, it helps you to win a debate in the short run if you can sort of shut down the conversation, but it's really not in your interest in the long run not to be able to have frank discussions about what's happening at the moment and what has happened in the past. And when we have a really frank and honest conversation about the past, I think we'll all agree, or almost everyone in this country would agree, it was a very bad idea. It didn't work. We can have some debates about what exactly led to the failure of the apartheid system. And I think that would be a useful conversation, because we'll all learn something from that. And we'll be exposed to different views, and we'll sharpen the saw and all of that. But we can't have that conversation. It's the same thing. The conversation about colonialism, and Helen Zille being the famous example, is you can't say anything about colonialism other than
well,
it's
she said
horrible
that
and
it
it's
wasn't all bad. It brought us roads
yeah,
and
I think you
schools.
mentioned
You're
the
like, oh,
the
that's
roads and
racist.
the piped water. Yeah, did you see that meme, or it's a clip from Monty Python where they spoke about what have the Romans ever done for us? And then the one guy said, "Well, they gave us roads." And he said, "Well, except for the roads,
Yeah,
what have
but
the
what if
Romans
we
ever
accept
done?"
that?
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, what about the aqueducts? Well, other than the roads and the aqueducts, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then you sort of go down the road. But again, you can't have that conversation.
I think it's curious because I actually came across something the other day, and I was reading it in a book. Side segment before I finish that thought. You see, one of the problems with obviously history in South Africa is it requires you to do this amazing thing. It's just been invented. It's called reading. You know, that you get these things called books. Maybe some people have heard about them. You'll see them in a museum. They used to be called libraries, and you could go in them and you could like borrow a book. And you see, like, book was like being like a drug addict, where you'd take LSD, you'd stare at a page, and like information would come into your head, like the Matrix. And people seem to have stopped the habit of reading, which is why history for them is like beyond them. But anyway, I was reading this book the other day, and I was reading something online, and I connected the two together, and it really actually bugged me for a minute. In 1919, when Hitler made his first speech around the final solution, it was a popular slogan to tell Jews to, are you waiting for it? Go back to Israel.
Oh, you
Which
see.
is ironic because in 2025, they quite often tell the Jews to go back to Europe. And there's a great degree of irony in that this is what happens to us. Now, the reason I say I was watching something on social media and I was like, was because I don't know if you know this, there was a protest in London. And this protest in London was done by some DER individuals that basically told, are you waiting for it? Colonizers to get out of Britain. That's their country. And anyway, you see, you're told quite a lot in South Africa, you're a colonizer and you should go back to Britain. And then you go back to Britain, and that's how you get out of
Go back.
Britain. So the
You have
so
to
the
get
question
out of
is,
everywhere. Yes.
and that in itself, like, now that we've established that, I think we can both agree that what they're really just saying, has actually very little to do with you going anywhere. It just has to be like with the Jewish question, it would just be anti-Semitic. You just don't like the people. It's not that you legitimately want them to go somewhere because you think it would be for their betterment. You just really don't like these people. Now, I think if we have that conversation and we're actually just honest with it, and you say, well, actually, maybe, just maybe, the reason you don't want Afrikaners here is just you just don't like him. Then we could maybe have a more honest conversation, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's I think it's worthwhile opening the conversation about a term like ethnic cleansing. Now, the risk with talking about something like ethnic cleansing is that it's a legal term, and when you talk about that, you have to, and it's the same thing with genocide. Like when you talk about genocide, you have to make sure that the thing that you are presenting complies with the definition. And so, but what I would like to say about ethnic cleansing as opposed to genocide is there's a difference. Genocide is about identifying a group of people and saying that we need to exterminate them. We need to, wherever they are, we need to find them and kill them. That's genocide. Ethnic cleansing is saying that we need to cleanse this society or this community or this country of a particular community. And ethnic cleansing is a broader term than genocide because ethnic cleansing includes methods that are not part of genocide. And so one of the examples about the difference between the two is comparing Adolf Hitler with Slobodan Milosevic. Hitler wanted to exterminate the Jews. Milosevic wanted the Muslims and the Arabs. He wanted them out of his country, and he was willing to kill them if needs be. But he was willing to take their land. He just wanted them out, and commit atrocities in doing so. But the thing is, when we think about that, it's really alarming to see what not necessarily is happening in South Africa, but what many of these people would like to do and what they say is the solution. Because it's some form of a combination of killing people, kill the boer, kill the farmer, but that combined with taking their property, getting them off the land, getting them out of the labor market. So in other words, BEE, race laws, all of these things, having different standards as far as their basic human rights are concerned. Jacob Zuma saying democracy works like this. If you are in the minority, you should have fewer rights. Now, if you add all of these things together, it's really concerning. And I really do think, at least politically, you can make the argument that there really are people in South Africa who seem to be bent on a course towards ethnic cleansing. They just want people who don't look like them out. That could be killing them. It could be inciting violence towards them. It could be taking their property. It could be discriminating against them in the labor market. Telling them to go back to Europe is an example, a manifestation thereof. But then we have this. The problem here is we have these double standards for. I think we should blame Western liberals first and foremost. This idea that we should sort of we should be tolerant, but tolerant towards some ideas and intolerant toward other ideas.
Yeah.
And so we have these double standards that where if it's a certain person saying this, then it's acceptable. If it's another person saying this, then it's something that should be the News 24 narrative, choosing your target and having different standards for people who comply with your target as opposed to people who you would like to defend.
I think it's curious because if you asked an average individual and you said to them, okay, right, why was apartheid bad? They said, well, you took our land. Okay, right. So you took let's follow this mode of thought. We took your land for the benefit of another. Yes, that's what you did. You tried to benefit the white man. Okay, and then they're like, well, you excluded us from the economy and you stopped us from being able to do certain things. Okay, and you didn't like it, right? Yeah, no, we didn't like it. Okay, well, you're now saying, so as a principle, you're against people taking your land and excluding you from the economy. What are you now trying to do to white people? You're trying to take their land and exclude them from the economy. But you're telling me it's good when you do it, but it's not good when I do it, right? Or the historical
Yeah, yeah,
narrative of when they did it, right? So you can't make that allegation. It's the same thing. It's the same argument as Idi Amin. As you know, Idi Amin was like, nope, we need to get rid of all the Indians. The Indians own everything, kick them out.
yeah,
So we take their land and then we redistribute all of their businesses and we give it through to black people. It's like, okay, well, was that a good thing or not? Because if you say when Idi Amin does it, it's good, when Jan van Riebeeck does it, don't say it's bad.
yeah.
Because if you're saying you agree with the principle, apply the principle universally. And you do tend to start having an understanding that it's not the principle they object to, it's the controller. It's the person who's in control. It's the person who's doing it that they object to.
Yes. So there was a good way of explaining this is also with reference to a book. You spoke about books. A book by Jill Wenzel called The Liberal Slide Away, which she wrote during, it was before the 80s, I think. It was during the anti-apartheid movement, and she was part of the anti-apartheid movement. Um,
Before the 80s, no, that's definitely in a museum, bud.
Yeah. And she spoke in the book about what she coined the 20 to 2 rule, which is something that Anthea Jeffrey also speaks about. And she said that people at the time were, especially liberals, were very much in support of the anti-apartheid movement. They wanted the apartheid system to end. And people wanted, these laws to end and so forth. But then she, Jill Wenzel, became concerned that while they were campaigning against apartheid, some of these organizations that they were championing were doing things that are really objectively evil in terms of violence in the townships, actually going out killing political opponents, and so forth. And she became concerned about this, that we're against something that is a bad idea, but the champions of the cause against this bad thing also seem to be not that clean and indefensible, or defensible. And so she then spoke about the 20 to 2 rule, which was, she noticed that you couldn't say something bad about the ANC unless you that followed after making a lengthy speech about just how bad the apartheid system was. And so she said it was like saying grace before a meal. You couldn't get to talking about what the ANC was doing wrong. You couldn't get to saying 2 sentences about what the ANC was doing wrong if you didn't spend at least 20 sentences about just how noble their cause is and how horrible the apartheid system is. And she said that she just wants to talk about, when she wants to talk about, what's wrong with the apartheid system, she wants to say it. And when she wants to talk about what the ANC is doing wrong, she wants to say it. But there was a particular narrative that became entrenched where it became very difficult to criticize those in power, at least those in power within the liberation movement, because you had to agree with their pursuit. And so if you criticize them, that was presented as that you don't agree with the pursuit of freedom for the peoples of South Africa. And again, I think this is something that benefits the ANC. It's a convenience to them. But I have to add, once again, I think many white liberals are to blame for this type of narrative that has kicked in, where we judge ourselves also by double standards.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. But I think you see that quite a lot nowadays, obviously, in any white individual, such as yourself and myself. I mean, if we criticize the ANC, that's not legitimate criticism. It's just, you're racist. I mean, come on, dude.
Yeah,
Clearly you're racist. I mean, how could you not agree with the ANC? Must be racist.
yeah, yeah. So it's that the concession would be that, okay, maybe it's not working, but at least their goals are good. At least they're trying to do a good thing, and they're not maybe doing it good properly. And the corruption thing is a bit of a problem, but the underlying ideological quest is something that you have to support. And if you don't support that, then there's something. Then you are inherently evil. That's certainly the way they would try to present it.
It's such a difficult issue at the moment, specifically around criticizing your government, because of this idea of what's the underlying intentions. And it actually comes back to the thing that we actually mentioned all the way at the start of this podcast, right? We're actually talking about how the ANC will say it's not land theft, right? It's redistribution. It's
Yeah.
equitable redistribution.
Yeah.
It's not economic exclusion. It's transformation.
Mm.
It's economic empowerment. How can you be against economic empowerment?
Mm. Or economic
Now, the reason
freedom.
I think
Can you be against economic freedom? Yeah.
oh, exactly right, and you must just be a racist. I mean, come on, dude. So, and you're trying to hold on to your historical position from apartheid. I mean, that would be the only logical answer. Why it becomes interesting is that these traps are all said by the older individuals, the individuals that are, let's call them better trained, maybe a little bit better educated. They come from the time before TikTok and smartphones, so they knew how to read.
Yeah.
A lost art these days. But as I said, these guys are disappearing, man. And so in response, you've got these individuals that only know how to claim that you're racist and that it must be Jan's fault because they heard that one time and it must be true. And outside of that, the rhetoric is just retarded. And I mean that frank. That's just retarded. And they don't really know what they're fighting against. And so the question really then becomes, well, now what? How do you have a meaningful conversation when the person that you're having a conversation with is just stupid? You can't negotiate with stupid.
Mm.
So where to from here?
So I think Roger Scruton made a remark about this that I think is useful. It's not so much a solution yet, but at least it's a description of the problem. It was within the context of a conversation about civilizational differences, and Samuel Huntington, who wrote The Clash of Civilizations, and the question to an extent is to what extent could we say that we live in a clash of civilizations? And I think that's largely true, but Roger Scruton had some caveat on that. He said that the idea of a clash of civilizations implies that you have two groups who are both interested in the idea of civilization in the first place. When I think part of what we have today is not simply different civilizations seeing things differently. It definitely is that as well. But there's also an element of a group of people who are just hell bent on destruction, who are anti civilization. They want to destroy the notion of civilization. And so it's like that old saying of the requirement for a gentleman's agreement is you need to have two gentlemen. You can't have a gentleman's agreement if only one person is a gentleman. And so that's the thing with this the battle of ideas that we want to have is you need to have two people who are part of this conversation who are both interested in the battle of ideas, who are both interested in the pursuit of truth. And they can have different opinions, but at least they must both be interested in getting to the right answer. But what we have is a debate or a struggle or whichever term you want to use with people who are not interested in that. They are not interested in truth. They are not interested in preserving civilization. They are not interested in building anything. The only thing that they are hell bent on doing is destruction, destroying something. We need to identify something that ought to be destroyed and then go out and destroy it. And so I think if the question then is, what do we do? I think firstly we need to recognize this reality. And I think in a certain sense, and I say this somewhat facetiously, that maybe the battle of ideas is overestimated. And the reason why I say this is because maybe there are some people or some groups or some organizations who are just fundamentally not interested in the battle of ideas, who are fundamentally not interested in having a conversation to reach some form of a conclusion. And now, what do we do? The solution is not to say, we need to go and destroy them. That's typically the leftist type of thinking. I think the answer lies in building strong institutions and reading books, making sure that we sharpen the saw as far as we are concerned, that we become better, that we are well organized in terms of our own communities, and that we defend ourselves not just through good arguments, but also through tangible things that we actually build and create, which include communities, but it also includes the institutions that we build within the context of our communities. And institutions can be many things. It can be a media platform, it can be a school, it can be a university, it could be a civil rights group, it could be a social club or a gathering. An institution can be many things, but it's only through meaningful, tangible institutions that we can ensure a future for these things that we think ought to be protected.
It's very interesting what you're saying. So I recently read this book, this historical artifact called "Who's Afraid of the Big Fat Jew?" And basically, it's a history book. It's an academic book around World War II and specifically Hitler's approach to the Holocaust and why he did what he did and some of his rhetoric and whatever else. Anyway, actually, towards the end of the book, there's an interesting line or is an interesting chapter which I think would equally be applied to the things that you're saying. And so the author in that book makes the argument that when a group of people are in these situations, historically, the preferred option has usually been assimilation. So assimilation is usually their attempt to say, see, we're not different to you, we're actually the same. So what we'll do is we're prepared to water down some of who we are to fit in with your perception of who we should be.
Yeah.
And he says that they usually think that by doing that, you placate the individual enough so that you become one of them and you're no longer a person who would be, should we say, targeted or victimized or whatever else, or discriminated against. And I think that's basically kind of what happened in 94. So everybody, we amalgamated into this mesh of what we envisaged South Africa would look like, this beigeness of South Africa. And in the process, he says the inevitable outcome is that the minute there is reason to remind you of your difference, they will remind you of your difference. And it will be at that point that your amalgamation will never be enough. And I think that's exactly where we are now. So we're in the situation where you're now reminded that you're a colonizer and you're white, and no matter what you've done, it's not enough because the country hasn't transformed and the land issue still needs to be addressed and what. And he says the inevitable outcome, the only way to protect yourself about that is to throw off the pretexts of amalgamating and actually to stand proud and to say, you're going to victimize me regardless, so I might as well be proud of who I am and establish a framework or a form of protection that protects me and my collective, whatever that collective might be. In this instance, it was obviously Jewish individuals. And they would establish a collective that would act as a buffer, almost as like a bulletproof vest, so that when the targeting, when they would point the fingers at you, you could at least say, okay, cool, I know I'm different. This is who I am. I'm proud of it. I'm not going to assimilate, and I've got my bulletproof. So no matter how much you shoot at me, I'm fine. I can take it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to change, because according to the author, change doesn't fix anything. And I think that's effectively what you're suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some work on this, among others by Thomas Sowell and others as well, about this idea of forced integration as opposed or as the solution to forced separation. And it's strange how we can all agree, and the world is sort of in agreement, that forced separation is a bad thing. But people don't want to say that forced integration is also a bad thing, because that has to be the answer to forced separation. And so Sowell's line on this is that people believe this because they want to believe this, but not because there's any evidence that forced integration solves societal issues. Because the underlying belief is that we're all interested in tolerance and so forth. So if you force people to live together against their will, they might be uncomfortable with that. They might have to make some sacrifices, but eventually they will see that it works, and there will be higher levels of tolerance and trust and so forth. And so, but Sowell's line is that all the evidence indicates to the contrary, that in the long run, it leads to higher levels of mistrust. It leads to higher levels of antagonism between communities and so forth. And so I think that the good news is that you don't need to choose between forced separation as opposed to forced integration, as if that's the only thing that you can do. The point is that there should be a recognition of communal dynamics, of the fact that within the context of communities, or people naturally organize themselves in some form of a collective, whether that's a language community, religious community, cultural community. And the solution simply lies in saying that we recognize that this is reality, that is just how things are, and we're going to respect people for the decisions that they make in these regard. And if you are look, different nations fight wars against each other, and so historically they would have different narratives on history and on their identity, and that's perfectly normal. It's perfectly natural. And I can have a debate with an white English speaking friend or someone who lives in England about the Anglo-Boer War, and we can differ about our interpretation of certain events. The same way I can have a debate, or I can have a disagreement with a Zulu person about the Battle of Blood River or something like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the one is right and the other one is wrong. It just means that people naturally organize themselves in a communal sense, and the way forward lies in recognizing that. And even if you don't like it, just recognize that that's just how things are. But if you try to destroy that dynamic, it's only going to lead to a backlash. It's only going to lead to more friction. And South Africa is a perfect case study of how these sort of globalist anti-community solutions simply do not work. It simply leads to a backlash and to a disillusionment at the end of the day.
That's because it's the battle for meaning, right? So it's the same idea of, let's say, for example, the argument between Christians and Jews. Okay, so Christians will say that Jesus was the Messiah. Jews will say no, he isn't. Right. So what's the commonality between the two? Well, they both agree that Jesus existed. Like
Yes.
he was a person. You both agree on this, right? So
Yeah.
you do actually have some form of basis based in fact, but it's what it actually means that is the issue. And that's ultimately where the issue comes in, is that it's the battle for meaning. And it's the battle for meaning that people don't often have an understanding of, because the idea of what does it mean. Jordan Peterson's very famous for this, right? He'll say, people say to him, does God exist? And he goes, well, I don't know. And he goes, because if he does, what does that mean? And he loves to talk about the meaning of things,
Yeah.
you know. And so that obviously had Richard Dawkins describe him as being drunk on symbolism, because everything's got to have a meaning. But he understands something fundamentally important, and that is the idea of meaning is complicated and requires a serious amount of thinking. And it's on that backdrop that you've established a new organization to have these very, very big, meaningful conversations around what do these things mean, and what does this mean politically, and what kind of political pressure can we exert on the government in order to exact change?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good segue, because the whole theme of meaning really goes to the core of this. I want to add to that, with reference to C.S. Lewis, who wrote in The Abolition of Man he spoke about men without chests, how we are raising men without chests, which is something that G.K. Chesterton also spoke about. And so the Greek approach, the Platonic and Aristotelian attempt at trying to describe the human soul, was to say that a person really consists of three categories, or three parts. There are three parts to us that make us who we are. And so the one part is the nous, which is the intellectual side of who we are. Another part is the epitomia, which is our desires. We have certain desires. And that can be, the desire to eat. Is you don't have much control over that, but that makes you who you are. Sexual desires, and people have instincts and desires, over which you have little control, but that in a way makes us who we are. And then the third one is in what they call in Greek the thumos. And so the thumos is the desire for meaning. It's a form of desire, but it's something else than wanting to eat. It's wanting a sense of belonging, wanting to know that what you are doing is meaningful, that the thing that on which you are spending your time will have some long-term benefit, and so forth. And so C.S. Lewis' line on this was that modernity has sort of eroded the thumos, this sense of belonging. And so he describes these three things. The intellectual side he likens to the brain, and then the desires he likens to the stomach. He says that's the stomach part of us, and then the thumos is the heart, the spirited part of us. And so his concern was that modernity is raising men without chests, because it's teaching us to be intellectual. It's teaching us about science and all of these things, and it's teaching us about doing what you want to do and choosing what you want to do and do it, and so forth. But the heart of the whole thing is having a sense of belonging is somehow made suspicious. It's something that you should not want to do. You should not want to have a sense of belonging. And in as far as you do, it's something that you should try to combat. And I think this is very relevant to the South African discussion, because I think we have lost that in the South African context as well. And the truth of the matter is that there are different communities in South Africa, and it's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's just a reality. And if we want to talk about a solution for these communities of South Africa, the first part of the solution ought to be that we ought to recognize that there are in fact communities in South Africa. South Africa is not just one big amalgamation, and that different communities have different ways of thinking, they have different preferences, and encouraging respect for that, as opposed to trying to destroy this diversity. So it's diversity in the real sense of the word, which is recognizing diversity and cherishing that and respecting that, as opposed to somehow this warped sense of diversity that people present as diversity nowadays, which is just to destroy differences between people, to just throw everyone into a melting pot and then believe that somehow now we have achieved diversity, when in fact what it's doing is it's destroying diversity. So I think in terms of moving forward, we need to rehabilitate what diversity actually means, and we need to rehabilitate what freedom means, and I think that's a fundamental starting point to move forward within the South African context.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you know him. There's he's classed as YouTube's most popular Rabbi Friedman. He's actually got some very interesting stuff. So he's a guy with the big bushy beard. Anyway, he talks quite a bit. He says if you were to define the differences between an animal and a human on the most basic level, it would be that an animal is governed by his instinct and a human knows how to override it. So it's a very interesting concept, because as you say, in modernity now, it's like, well, your instincts tell you to do X, you should trust them and just do that. So you're not taught how to override them anymore. You're actually taught to embrace them, which is where you get this form of societal collapse, because people stop thinking and making moral judgments, and instead they just kind of like do what feels good. And sometimes what feels good is it's like eating KFC all day. Man, that'd be great. It's not going to do you very good for your heart and your cholesterol, right? You understand that's probably going to kill you. So, it's a good way of explaining it. But obviously, in that context, sorry.
No. Just to link to that, I think that's a very biblical way, and also a New Testament way of thinking at it. So Paul wrote about this in his letters, and he explains it as the difference between the fruits of the flesh as opposed to the fruits of the spirit. And the fruits of the flesh is just doing whatever you want to do, and that's what animals do. They do what they want to do. And if you live in the fruits of the spirit, and that's where the spiritedness comes in, the thumos comes in, it's to recognize that there are some things that are sort of bigger picture, more important things. And on a very sort of micro, almost minuscule level, that could include something like not not eating more than you need to eat. When
Mm.
if you're an animal, you just eat until you're full. Sometimes as a human being, you have to say, okay, I'm not going to do this. I would like to do this, but I'm not going to do this. But there's a much
Mm.
deeper thing to this as well, which is sometimes people there are degrees of biases between communities. Sometimes you don't like people simply because they don't think the way you do. And I think
Mm.
these are typical examples of what we need to transcend, is to say, well, if this person or this community does things differently than I do, I can still respect them for having their own view. But the solution to that is not to destroy the diversity.
I'd agree. So how is your new organization actually going to combat this, or how do you intend to advance the dialogue, to advance the discussion?
Yeah, so the initiative is it's the fundamental vision statement is that South Africa needs a more sustainable political dispensation. So it's a macro political quest. And in doing this, we believe that there are broadly three things that ought to be done. And it's a combination of three things. The one is, and it links a bit to the three, the heart, the stomach, and the mind to an extent. So the one part of it is the thinking part. It is to say that we need to serve to an extent, at least as a think tank. We need to think creatively about macro political solutions for South Africa, because the solution to the South African crisis is not simply that we need another president or we need another party to win the election, because the underlying structural problems would not go away if some other person becomes the president. And so we need to think creatively, and that does not imply going back to the past. It implies learning from the past, but not returning to the past. Um, that's one side of it. The other side is actively talking about this and garnering support for this, because a more sustainable political solution for South Africa could take different forms. We believe the underlying foundational principles should be decentralization of the political system, less power to the president, less power for the ruling party, and so forth. Combined with the idea of self governance, people should have more power over
Mm.
their own affairs, more authority over their own affairs. Government should be closer to the people, and so forth. So that could take different forms, and we should investigate these different forms as the first part of the solution, or what we intend to do. And the second part is talking about this, raising awareness about this, getting more and more people and communities within South Africa and outside of South Africa to support this, to publicly say South Africa needs dispensational reform. It needs political reform in terms of the system, or systemic reform. And then the third part, after the thinking and the speaking, is the doing. And the doing part
Mm.
is it seems difficult at first glance, because it's how do you eat an elephant? You have to take it piece by piece. But there are a lot of things on a
Piece by
sort of
piece, yeah.
on a micro level that you can do. You organize conferences and arrange events and so forth. But this needs to lead to a more tangible, bigger scale, you could say, movement or activities on a larger scale, with people pushing for the idea that South Africa needs institutional structural reforms which will bring government closer to the people, so that people have more freedom over their own affairs.
Mm. Interesting. It's an interesting idea, because what you're effectively doing is describing the American model. I mean, the original American model, right?
Yeah.
Which is actually governance by self, as opposed to governance by state, for all the logical reasons that there were. And obviously, from a communist mindset, which obviously the ANC carries some communist ideology, that's not an appealing notion, because which requires decentralization, not centralization of command. And as you know, they like to have their greedy mitts in everything. So having a decentralized command would not fit ideologically with this idea of, their overall kind of centralized power. And so logically, the way to dismiss that is not to dismiss it based on the merits, but just to say, well, Ernest, you're just a racist and you just want to live on your own.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
obviously that's going to be the pushback that you get. with that being said, do you envisage it actually being successful? I mean, what does success look like for you?
Well, success would be a different political system for South Africa. That's that
Mm,
a different constitutional dispensation. That would be, but not just different, a more decentralized one that brings government closer to the people. Now,
mm,
the one of the first questions we get is people saying, "But how on earth are we going to achieve this? Because we're never going to convince the ANC or the government that this is a good idea," which is true. But the same point was made with regard to the National Party during the 1970s and 80s when people said, how on earth are you going to convince the National Party that the apartheid system has to end? And the
mm,
fact of the matter is that sometimes political systems just crumble. It's not so much about those in power wanting to change things, but those in power not having any alternative option because they don't have power
mm,
anymore because it has just crumbled under their feet. That's what happened to the apartheid system, but that is what has happened all over the world where there was big macro political change. And I think it's fairly safe to say that that is already happening in South Africa, that whatever we have in South Africa, however you want to describe it, is not sustainable. It's
mm.
very difficult to imagine the current situation in South Africa just remaining for the next 5 or 10 decades. It's going to change. Things are going to change. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. It's
Let me
usually
just
me.
let me just switch this off. This is actually our lawyer calling. He wants to um, give some feedback on our trademark. So the fact is that things are changing and things are going to continue to change, and we need to be prepared for that change. We need to be well organized for that change, and I think the most important things we need to do is a combination of these three. It's having very good ideas, creative ideas about what a more sustainable change could look like. It's actively talking about this, encouraging support for this, garnering support within South Africa, within the communities living in South Africa, and with friends abroad who fall behind this, who say, listen, we think this is a more sustainable solution. And then the third point is actually going out and doing things to
Mm.
achieve this. And so this is a call for constitutional change. It's not treason or invading the union buildings or something like that. It's asking for, or not asking, it's saying that the system is changing and we need to make sure that in as far as it does change, it changes for the better and not for the worse.
I'm going to ask you three questions on the basis of that, and hopefully you remember all three. Sorry, but just while I can think about them. So the first is, what would you say to all the people that say you're wasting your time? This place is just going to become Zimbabwe, because
Yep.
that's going to be your inevitable answer. The second question is going to be, well, how does that fit? I mean, according to many individuals, they would say that the current dispensation is deliberately destroying things in order to shuffle in the NDR and go down the National Democratic Revolution in order to usher in a communist utopia, and this is all going to plan. Others would say, no, the NT is just retarded and they're destroying things by accident as opposed to design.
Mm.
And then the last question I'm going to ask you is, how's this all fit in with you? You said people need to be there to do the work. So how do you envisage Trump's offer, this refugee offer? Do you think that's going to impact the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, I think those are three three very important questions. Let me just remember the first one. It was about the national.
Zimbabwe.
Oh, the Zimbabwe. So I think the difference here, there's much that we should learn from Zimbabwe, and we
Mm,
should be concerned about the road South Africa is going down. But there are some important differences, and one is many people, and some people would criticize me or would disagree with this, but many people who lived in Zimbabwe at the time of these changes saw England as sort of a second home or a place that you could retreat to. And I know a lot of people didn't want to go, but a lot of people did go. When I think our reality in South Africa is that there's a really, really strong section of society that has no other home, that sees nowhere, no other place in the world as being their home, that believes that if we go to Holland or America, we will lose a very important part of our identity. So that's one aspect. But another aspect is that South Africa is, and the communities in South Africa are much better organized in terms of civil society than people were in Zimbabwe. And especially talking about at the time when Mugabe implemented the land reform, these very aggressive land reform programs, people believed that the solution or the way to counter what the government was doing was through opposition parties. And they only had that was the only card they actually had was opposition parties. There were also some people who said, we need to be friends with ZANU-PF, we need to influence them from within, and we don't need to, there's typical appeasement policies that you hear in South Africa sometimes as well. We need to be friends with them and, show them that we're not that bad and cooperate and so forth, and then they wouldn't.
It's the amalgamation argument from the book, right?
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. And that didn't work. The opposition point argument didn't work. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have opposition parties. Obviously, we should. But the difference is we have a very strong civil society, and we need to strengthen civil society, or put in different words, what we have and what we need to continue to do is to strengthen the extent to which people are well organized outside political parties, outside party politics, and vote in elections and do all of those things. But if you're not well organized in the civil society sphere, you're going to have trouble. And so I think that at least is the answer to, as far as I'm concerned, to the Zimbabwean concern.
And what would you then say on the NDR issue? People that say this is all by design. This isn't by accident. This is happening by design. It's because they want communism.
Yeah, it's sort of happening by design, except what is not happening according to design by those in power is they actually expected things to work. They thought they will move down this road to communism. And, well, I'm not sure if they actually believe this, but this is at least what they said, that they're going to eradicate poverty. They're going to eradicate inequality and eradicate unemployment. And they haven't done that. These things have gotten worse as a result of these policies through which they claim to eradicate these things. So yes, in a certain sense, it is by design, but I don't foresee the ANC or the organizations close to the ANC, aligned with the ANC ideologically. I don't foresee that they will change course, and I don't think we should try. Our success cannot depend on the extent to which we can convince the ANC that property rights is a good idea. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage and we shouldn't have these debates and we shouldn't go to court and so forth, but we're not going to convince them. And so a much more sustainable approach or strategy is to make sure that in as far as we take a stance, for example, for the protection of property rights, that we are strong in doing this, that they cannot just override us and take our stuff, that we can defend what we have. It's the prospect of protecting property by physically defending it is much more sustainable than the prospect of defending or protecting property by means of convincing those in power that they should respect property. And so, yes, a lot of what's happening in South Africa is by design, although not quite to the extent to which they would have liked things to play out. And their solution is just to double down. So they are going to try to double down, and we should not allow them to double down, not by simply saying don't do it, but by having strong institutions and well-organized communities to such an extent that they aren't able to double down on these things.
And many would argue that underneath the current administration, that's exactly what they've done. In fact, they've almost tripled down on it. Like BE is a good example. BE seems to have, since the new dispensation, have gone on steroids, as you know.
Yep.
And obviously, organizations such as Solidarity have, and obviously, your former organization, AfriForum Solidariteit, have been fighting against many of these laws in the courts, which is great. But what would your comment then be on the final question, which is around Trump's refugee offer? What do you think that will do to the Afrikaners? Because you've very clearly said you think that one of the differences between Zimbabwe and South Africa is that we have an entrenchment of some individuals, specifically Afrikaners,
Mm.
that would cause South Africa to be very important to their very survival. You can't be an Afrikaner outside of South Africa for obvious reasons. And there's now this new reframing of what they're calling Amerikaners. I don't make up the names.
Yeah.
And there's a whole website based to it and everything. And they seem to feel that their future rests in America because somehow they won't just become American. It's something that I've mentioned on Morning Show quite a few times. It's like the struggle for Jews in the diaspora has been difficult. How do you retain your Jewishness when you're in the diaspora amongst multiculturalism? Because the easiest path is basically to amalgamate. It's just to become like your host nation. And this is an issue that's not unique to Afrikaners. It's unique to any culture that goes into these societies. It's an issue that Tibetans are dealing with right now. How do you retain being Tibetan when you're amalgamated into China? Because you just become Chinese. And so the same thing would inevitably happen with Afrikaners. You go to America, you'd end up becoming, well, American. If you're South African, you go to Australia and you become Australian. It's just this life. Get over it. But how do you think that offer is going to impact, should we say, the Afrikaners' love of their land and staying in the country of their birth?
So yes, I think the refugee thing has the potential to backfire for America because from what I can see, um, I don't really know a lot of people who want to leave South Africa. Actually, I do see some people like that online, but from what I can see, those who want to leave can broadly be categorized into three categories. Um, the first is people who have experienced some form of trauma. So they were in a farm attack or a hijacking or something, horrible happened to them, and it has, in a sense, had a significant impact on their lives, and they want to get out. Um, that's the one. The other category is people who are struggling economically for whatever reason. They don't have a job, they're trying to find work and they can't find it, and the prospect of going to America seems like a solution. Uh, and then the third category is young people, like young Afrikaners, but not just Afrikaners, who are like in their 20s and they want to get experience and they want to go somewhere to work. And I think what I don't see is the CEOs and the highly skilled people who are employed, who are the mega farmers and so forth. I don't see them in large numbers planning to immigrate. So that's one side of it. The other thing is, if people want to go, I think they should have the right to do so. And if America makes it easier for such people to go, that's good. What is important, however, from as far as a solution here in South Africa is concerned, is it's really bad for us if people leave and they become disconnected. It could be good. It could be really good for us if people go to other countries and they are still outspoken and they play an active role there where they
I
are.
don't I don't see that happening. I mean, you see it in Australia, right? Look, they go in large numbers and they just forget about the country of their
Assimilate.
birth. And unless it's a rugby game, and then they're like, hey, they're all for South Africa, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I
I'm
think
a boka boka at that point.
in Australia, there was an example of that working with, there was a few years ago a big protest march in, was it Perth or Sydney? I can't remember, against the farm
I think it
killings.
was Perth.
Yes.
Yes.
So we did see that, but you are right. I have friends and people who live abroad who I've spoken with, and they would say the way to make it is to assimilate. Eventually, you assimilate, and
You
that,
always assimilate.
yeah,
Yeah.
if you cannot go to another country with the conviction that you would not assimilate, because you undermine your own prospect of success. And so that is it,
100%.
it is a problem if people just go and assimilate and they lose their roots to South Africa or to their own culture and so forth. But there are people, I mean, we have contact with people, we have people who contribute to our organization who live all over the world who want to be in some way part of the solution. And that could imply small things like writing to your politician, like writing to your senator or member of parliament and saying, listen, what are you saying about what's happening in South Africa? And if we can organize people like that in large numbers, it will certainly be to our benefit.
So I'm glad that you mentioned some of this, because I've recently made well, not that recent, but I made some comments actually to Chris Wyatt, because I call Chris Wyatt. Actually, I went to one of his speeches and I listened to some of what he was saying. Some of it I didn't agree with, and then I made a video where I made a very slight comment, and it's one of those small comments that then blew up into lots of people getting really upset over nothing. Anyway, the comment was, coming back to your scenario, you said there's going to be people that have suffered a trauma, they want to leave, and then there's people that can't get a job, and then people that want experience. And my comment to that is, the first one is a refugee program, the other two are economic migration. They are not refugees. Right, and there's a fundamental difference, because if you're holding out for refugee status as being your answer to life's woes, you don't need refugee status to have economic migration. People have been economically migrating for 30 years. There's a serious amount. There's over 2 million South Africans that have left. So
Yep.
you don't need refugee status for that. I understand some people may want refugee status for, as you said, a trauma. And I suspect that the rules will be written in such a way that they will only capture people with trauma. Otherwise, it's a disaster. But the reason I mention all that is because, to a degree, there are a number of individuals that seem to think that they can't economically make it in South Africa, which is effectively, I think you'd agree, you're very well traveled, as am I, so you have an understanding of this. But they will say to you, well, it's very difficult to make it in South Africa based on the economic situation. I have no prospects of immigration because I don't have qualifications or experience, or maybe I'm sick. And it's like, your answer to this is going to an economy that's more expensive, that has very little social welfare, and you've got to pay for all of your medical treatment through your nose. That's not an easy solution. I understand. And it's in that backdrop that potentially you should really consider it to only be an option to you if you were really, really struggling and you had been subject to some form of trauma. That was the point that basically I was trying to make. Do you get a sense, though, that the majority of individuals that actually are suggesting they want to leave actually has nothing to do with trauma? It is just purely economic.
I don't know if it's the majority, but what I do know from speaking with people who have been working with this is that a lot of the people who have indicated that they want to go, they want to apply for refugee status, would would qualify for a work permit, or would be able to leave the country in other ways, through other means as well. So yes, there certainly is that. I don't think the whole thing hasn't progressed enough for us to be able to talk about this, with statistics and say this is the percentage of people and so forth. But yes, I think in a certain sense, I think you're right that a lot of people who want to go can go, regardless of whether it's refugee status or not. And the refugee status thing, I'm not an expert on that, but it's not as simple and as easy, as people would like to believe. And it's not a
I've
solution
made
to what's happening
I've
in
made
South
that comment. But you see, many individuals think they're just going to go, I'm Afrikaans, and here's a video of Julius Malema singing Kill the Boer, can I come? They go, yeah, 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 here's the door. Off you go. It's like,
Africa.
yeah, it don't work that way.
Yeah. But the thing is, we need to find a solution for the crisis that we are in South Africa. And if the only attempt at fixing it is refugee status, then it's actually making things worse.
I
So,
agree.
so that could be one aspect of what is done. And international pressure is very important. And we need that. But the refugee thing can only be one part of some form of a package deal. It cannot be the only thing. Because firstly, I don't think it's going to be that successful. But secondly, it doesn't really contribute to an actual tangible solution where we are.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that they're trying to fix anything. I mean, economically, this is what a lot of people don't understand: is that within the next 15 years, Africa will house 50% of the world's population, meaning that it's strategically one of the most important continents on the planet. And so, if you want to gain control over that, well, you need to start exerting political pressure now. And this is actually something that
Mm.
Prince Mashele has been saying on some of his stuff. He's been saying, if you actually look at it, he says, when an economy suffers, when a country burns, you've got two options. Number one is you pack your bags and you leave. Number two is you have to stay and fight. There's no in between.
Yeah.
And as he rightly says, if you're packing your bags and leave, you must pack your bags and leave those who want to fight to fight. That's his words, not mine.
Mm.
But it's a very interesting dynamic because in my experience, the problem at the moment with the refugee offer appears to be that many individuals are hedging their bets. How are they going to fix the current issues? I'm gonna get this refugee offer that hasn't been announced, and I'm going to leave, and then that's going to be the end of it, and I'll put my life on pause for 2 years whilst that gets sorted. And we've seen that for a long time with other, immigration programs where people go to Australia. That can take up to 2 years to complete, and and they just put their life on hold. And so rather than actually fight to fix the place, it's like, well, and that's my fear with the refugee program, right? Is that people won't get involved with things like your initiative or actually make proactive steps to improve their situation. Because don't worry, there's this program coming and it's going to let me leave, even
Yeah.
though it might
Well,
not come. You know
the
what I mean?
the the only thing, oh, I think Prince Mashele is right in saying that. The only thing that I would add is I think there's some nuance that we should consider as well. Is when we say stay and fight, we must just define what does that mean, because
And
I
and
think,
and he does. I just want to clarify that, just so
mm,
I don't get his position wrong, because
yeah,
he's got me on WhatsApp and he'll message me and he'll be like, "You got that wrong." So he actually says that getting involved in an institution, that getting involved in a political party, even doing a podcast to discuss the topic, is fighting. He says
yeah,
that we are lucky to live in a country where fighting isn't pick up your machine gun and go fight in the streets. He says fighting includes debating the topic.
yeah, yeah. So I think we should. The great thing is we're all unique. We have different proclivities, different talents, different personalities, and so we can all find a unique place in this fight. Some people are very good at podcasting. Some people are good at doing research, and some people are good at posting or preparing things for social media or editing or whatever. I mean, there's just, or organizing events. I mean, we can just keep listing examples. And so the important thing is to find your place in this bigger scheme of things. And I think if people can do that in bigger numbers, it would certainly lead to a better outcome, as opposed to just people leaving the country. And again, if you leave the country, that's not by definition a bad thing. If you play some form, if you contribute from where you are, that's still good. But what we need now is people to be more actively involved in whichever way they think is appropriate according to their own frame of reference, their own skill sets, and so forth.
So how can people get involved in what you're doing?
Well, I think we're building a new institution, and I think if you can have the link in the description, that will help for people to sign up. The most important thing that we need to do now is get the institution to a point where it's financially sustainable, where, in other words, we have the capacity to pay for the salaries for 2 or 3 people, and we have the capacity to go out and organize things. So the most important thing is we need people to contribute, and if people can do that, that would be very helpful. But through these structures, we issue newsletters, and I'm sure many of your viewers are already on the newsletter. They can become more actively and more tangibly involved. So we do plan on arranging events and so forth, speaking events, even just if it's social events as well. And we do plan on getting people outside of South Africa involved as well. So to provide a platform for these people we've spoken about, who live in Holland or America or Canada or wherever, who feel that they want to contribute in some way, not just financially, but in a way that is a bit more practical and tangible. So we need to get people on our newsletter, and we need to get people to contribute to the organization, and then through that it will be much easier for them to play some form of an active role in all of this.
I'd love to support myself, so I'll actually pledge all the monetization from this video. I'll send to your organization.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. I'll really appreciate that. And obviously, we'll be online. We'll be on. We are online. We're on all the social media platforms and so forth. So people can find us there, and there's a policy framework and so forth on the website. So if they're curious, they can go and read about it on there as well.
Cool, perfect. Anyway, I've nearly kept you here an hour and a half. This is the longest I've done an interview, but I must admit, I actually enjoyed having the interview with you. I actually really enjoyed the conversation. So
thank you.
Hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, you enjoyed it too. I really did. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for the viewers.
Thanks very much.